Starfield isn't that bad. The game has been absolutely hammered both in terms of discourse online and in terms of user reviews on platforms like Steam. Right now, Steam is sitting at a 60%. Granted, some of those ratings are due to a recent bomb, but regardless of that fact, it wasn't like it had a high rating before that. It wasn't always this way though. When the game launched, it was ranking in the high 80 percentile with thousands of reviews, some with 50 hours into the game at that point. The Metacritic score landed right above 80 from professional critics. However, as time went on and more reviews flooded in, the score continued to drop, first to the low 80s, then to the mid 70s, and on into the low 70s. Today we're sitting at a 60% rating on Steam with just over 140,000 reviews. Though if you look at the most recent editions, there has been a massive bomb of negative reviews that are further dragging the score down. Therefore, the recent reviews category is rated as mostly negative, but the all-time consideration remains mixed. Metacritic's user score settled in the end at 6.9. It's safe to say this game invoked a very strong reaction to the negative, though I can only speculate as to why. Starfield is a Bethesda game, and I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that it would play like a Bethesda game. It was a well-known fact that it was running on the modern version of LBRY, and all the limitations that engine entails. Full disclosure here, I bought Starfield when it launched. I didn't buy the early release edition or anything. I waited until the full release of the game and dived in. Further disclosure, I didn't know a lot about the game beforehand. All I really knew is that it was a Bethesda RPG game with a space theme. I intentionally avoided a lot of pre-launch exposure the game was given. Hell, I don't even particularly like space as a setting for games. But having felt so starved for a Bethesda-style RPG, I was willing to give it an honest shot. I'm going to go over some of the frequent complaints I've observed about the game, and while I don't plan necessarily to refute them, I'm going to talk about them from my perspective. First on the list is technical problems. I personally didn't have any problems running the game, and it ran at the highest resolution I could comfortably run while maintaining a solid frame rate. And I can only think of maybe once or twice that I ran into something I would consider a substantial bug or crash, which was honestly downright shocking to me. The last Bethesda game I put serious time into near launch was Skyrim, and that was on the PlayStation 3 console. If you know anything about that, then you know there was some sort of bug that caused the game to increasingly slow down as your save file ballooned to massive sizes. I don't remember the details as it was so long ago now, but suffice to say, before long the game became downright unplayable. Starfield, on the other hand, was pretty impressive, at least for me, in terms of functionality and lack of general problems. I sincerely expected more jank, no doubt about it. And while I didn't have any express issues, I'm not discounting those that others had. PC configurations can be of all sorts, and it's expected that there will be some hiccups. This one isn't cut and dry. It is what it is. Some people are going to have problems, and others aren't. But I do think in terms of bug prevalence, this is one of Bethesda's better attempts, and they've come a long way since I was playing the bug-ridden Daggerfall in 1996. What about that uninspired writing? This is a frequent complaint, and honestly, I don't even have all that much to say about it. The writing is serviceable in most cases, and that's about it. There's nothing in this game in terms of narrative that blew me away. I probably even enjoyed certain questlines that everyone seems to love less than most, such as the UC Vanguard. I think the factions were undercooked, and the main quest felt exceedingly repetitive, and in consideration of the New Game Plus option, I think they really missed a massive opportunity here. Instead of doing what they should have, which is really harken back to the style of Morrowind in which any NPC is killable, they continue with the essential NPC nonsense, which feels even worse in Starfield for some reason. The New Game Plus and how it's done presents the perfect opportunity to allow players to make decisions that lock off entire questlines or resolutions, because that character is no longer locked into the same world. Simply give the player the ability to always circumvent the quest in order to somehow acquire the artifacts and enter the Unity, thus creating a new universe and having the ability to continue those questlines you disabled due to murders. If anything, factions should have been more intense in the sense that it would have been perfectly okay to have the player not be able to join all factions at once. Give us a reason to replay the game. As it stands, the only purpose of replaying a New Game Plus is very minimal. There are some things that can change in the main quest and a few minor details otherwise. While this is neat and interesting, it's definitely not a great reason, at least for me, to play through this game again. Having factions that had alignment criteria in terms of who you were affiliated with could have drastically changed that and encouraged replayability or a New Game Plus. However, I think in order for this to be possible, I think factions would have to be further fleshed out than they are, As it stands, they are very rudimentary and have essentially no interaction between one another. Even quests that exist outside of the factions can be problematic in this regard. There just aren't enough options in how the player can conclude these quest lines. Take, for example, the ship that had been in transit for hundreds of years and ends up above planet Paradiso. I thought for sure I would be able to resolve this by decimating the executives on Paradiso, but that's not an option at all. I ended that whole ordeal fairly disappointed because I felt funneled into a resolution I didn't want to make. Regardless, Starfield could have used more attention in this department. There's no doubt about it. But is it downright awful? I don't think I'd go that far. I still think it's serviceable. I don't think Bethesda's writing has been powerful or great since Morrowind, and that's just what it is. What about the planets? Yeah, the planets are empty. I don't think the general design for Starfield in terms of planets is all that amazing, but it's not downright awful either. It reminds me of the indie game Star Explorers, in which you've maybe or maybe not heard of. In Starfield, players choose a planet and land on what is essentially a procedurally generated square that's a fairly large size. The problem isn't there, at least not for me. The problem comes into play when we get to the generated points of interest. I absolutely couldn't believe that every cryolab is the same cryolab. I thought for sure they were going to have at least multiple revisions of each of these locations. I think this was a huge miss for Bethesda, and while it's mostly enjoyable to play through the first time, this is another knock for replayability. I do think they nailed the gunplay better than ever before, but the problem lies in where you'll be playing with those guns. The same locations, over and over. There's nothing substantial to encounter on the overworlds except for the occasional ship landing nearby, so all the action has to happen within these areas by default, and considering the lack of eventual diversity of these locations, that is inherently a problem. As I said though, it's a solid romp the first time through these locations, but there's very little incentive to find them again, and while I personally enjoy scanning planets, locations, and creatures overall, I could easily see where some may not be enticed by it, and I fully understand that. This brings me to base building. I think the base building is well done, and mostly interesting in terms of tying multiple bases together in order to acquire the materials you want in a given system. The problem is that you have no particular reason to acquire those materials. I built several bases and began amassing all kinds of materials and ended up just dumping them into a habitat building to create this massive stack because I didn't really have any purpose to have them. I was just initially interested in the minigame itself as far as building and connecting bases in order to get a functioning whole. I think the game could have benefited from having some need for acquiring the resources. Further, I think the game could have benefited from more survival elements. Todd Howard himself talks about how they really nerfed a lot of the survival elements, such as ship fuel and hazardous conditions, sometime before launch, as they determined it just wasn't fun. But why not ship it anyway as an option? I have no doubt this kind of thing will come from an eventual survival mode patch, but it really needed this from launch, I think. One of my biggest complaints would be the seeming downgrade of NPCs and NPC behavior. Since Oblivion, we have effectively had schedules for them and more activity in general. NPCs would sleep and have activities or locations they would go to. Starfield removes all of that. Shopkeepers sit at their desk 24/7 and NPCs are basically walking around randomly. While I got over it pretty quickly, it's a weird choice to make and just further indicates that Starfield could have used more time. Either that, or they thought the players simply wouldn't be spending enough time in given areas to really appreciate it. I honestly don't have an answer to this, but NPCs are a huge downgrade. Not to mention their lack of appropriate reactions to having weapons unholstered, or even shooting them in some cases. And of course, I can't not bring up everyone's seeming elephant in the room, the loading screens. I don't mind them personally, and they are pretty much in line with what I expected from a Bethesda game running on their engine. I can only assume that a lot of people had false impressions about what this game was going to play like, and whether marketing is to blame for that directly, or their own internal expectations, I don't know and can't answer that, as it's an individual thing. All I know is that I personally wasn't surprised at the level of loading screens and fast travel. There are some obvious downsides to the way the game is constructed, but it has less to do with load screens and more to do with the method in which the universe is designed. Typical Bethesda design of heading from point A to point B and getting engaged in something along the way has a much harder time in this setting. But the main reason for that is the areas you are visiting are going to be mostly desolate with little going on. I think this could have been mitigated with more, smaller points of interest in areas to generated small-scale quests. There are some such things you can find, but not to the extent this game really needed it. The very nature of designing a space game in the way they did means most areas of interest are going to be heavily concentrated, within the cities themselves specifically. Now there are times that I had to go from one city, say Neon, to Aquila, and while I was in that process ended up finding something else interesting and something else to do, but not to the degree of their previous titles. I think this is disappointing, but not entirely unavoidable due to the structure of the universe they've designed. It just is what it is. Starfield needed more time in the oven in terms of quest variety and frequency, as well as more engaging gameplay mechanics such as survival components. And that's really what it boils down to for me. Despite being relatively long in the tooth in terms of development, Starfield really just needed more time cooking and a greater attention paid to various aspects of the game. There are things I think it does just fine, such as the firearm combat, and honestly I thought the space encounters were done about as well as could be expected from their engine. But there are things it falls flat, such as the depth and breadth of the factions, the lack of inherent replayability due to the low variety in terms of the points of interest the player can find. I think the reality is that Starfield is just alright. There was a lot of pressure riding on this game, and I think in this case I'd agree that Starfield probably failed to meet the expectations that appear to have been set out there. It basically met my expectations, but I didn't have them set very high either. I still enjoyed the game. I played for over 100 hours and pretty much enjoyed it all. But I don't foresee myself revisiting this title in the same way that I do with the Elder Scrolls titles, and that's a shame, but it is what it is. I feel like it gets bombarded harder than it deserves, but I also don't think it's a revolutionary new title. I would have much rather we had Elder Scrolls 6, but I understand the studio wanting to work on something different and give it a try. In the end, it's just another Bethesda game, and despite all the clamor online, I'm perfectly happy that Elder Scrolls 6 is being made in the same old engine, because that engine has a very specific feel to it that I enjoy. I still love going back to Morrowind to this day, and all the games in between, quirks and all. A lot of the problems that Starfield had won't be evident in Elder Scrolls because it will be designed with a much tighter map, and therefore half of the issues won't exist. The other half will just have to wait and see. If they do exist, hopefully strong world building and environmental artistry can help alleviate those, but I do have my doubts. I'm cautiously optimistic in regards to Elder Scrolls 6. I have my own gripes with what the Elder Scrolls have become, and one day maybe I'll make a video in regard to that. But for the time being, I'm still able to revisit those games regardless of the specific gripes I might have with each one of them. They're like a second home to me, and always have been, and hopefully always will be. But who can say what the future holds, really? If you enjoyed the video, please take a moment to drop a like. If you have something to say about the content of the video, Starfield, or Bethesda in general, drop a comment below. As always, you're welcome to subscribe to the channel to see all kinds of videos like this and more. Until next time.